The fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16, 1944, masking what would become Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. Major General Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps sat in his headquarters in Bastogne, unaware that 85 miles of his thinly held line was about to face the full fury of 3 German armies. Staff Sergeant William Henderson of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter as he peered through the mist from his foxhole near Schnee Eifel. The 22-year-old from Ohio had been telling his buddy Private James Murphy that something felt different about this morning. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled, almost expectant. Henderson had no way of knowing that 200,000 German soldiers were positioned just beyond the tree line, waiting for the signal that would launch Operation Watch on the Rhine. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division adjusted his leather gloves as he studied his watch in the pre-dawn darkness. The ambitious officer, handpicked by Heinrich Himmler himself, commanded Kampfer Peiper, a battle group of tanks and mechanized infantry tasked with racing to the Meuse River. His orders were clear: break through at all costs and seize the vital fuel depots that would sustain the German advance to Antwerp. According to military historian Hugh Cole's comprehensive analysis in the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, the German High Command had assembled their forces with unprecedented secrecy, moving entire divisions under cover of darkness and maintaining strict radio silence for weeks. The first artillery shells began falling at 5:30 that morning, shattering the winter quiet with a thunderous barrage that could be heard 20 miles away. Henderson dug deeper into his foxhole as 88mm rounds whistled overhead, exploding among the snow-laden fir trees with devastating precision. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes, the longest artillery preparation the Germans had mounted since the beginning of their offensive operations in the West. Private Murphy, crouched in the adjacent foxhole, shouted over the din that he could see muzzle flashes stretching as far as the eye could see. Through the forest, the young soldier from Michigan had joined the 106th Division only 3 weeks earlier, part of the massive reinforcement effort that had brought American strength in Europe to over 2 million men by late 1944. When the artillery finally lifted, an eerie silence settled over the battlefield for perhaps 30 seconds before the ground began to tremble with the approach of German armor. Peiper's lead elements, spearheaded by Panther tanks and supported by Panzer Grenadiers, emerged from the fog like mechanical phantoms. The SS officer had trained his men relentlessly for this moment, drilling them in night operations and rapid advance techniques that would be crucial for maintaining momentum in the fluid battle. He anticipated. Major General Norman Coda of the 28th Infantry Division received the first fragmentary reports of the German assault at his command post in Wiltz. The veteran officer, who had earned his reputation during the Normandy landings 6 months earlier, immediately recognized the scale of what his forces were facing. This was no limited spoiling attack or reconnaissance in force. This was a full-scale offensive, designed to split the Allied armies and potentially change the course of the war. The fog that had concealed the German preparations now worked against the defenders, making it impossible for Allied aircraft to provide close air support or even conduct reconnaissance flights to determine the enemy's strength and direction of advance. Henderson and his fellow soldiers of the Golden Lions Division found themselves fighting a phantom enemy that appeared and disappeared in the mist, like something from a nightmare. By midday on December 16th, the magnitude of the German offensive became clear to Allied commanders as reports flooded in from across the front. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, received urgent communications from General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters, indicating that German forces had achieved multiple breakthroughs along an 85-mile front stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. Kampfer Peiper had punched through the American lines near Lasheim Gap, exploiting a boundary between the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. The SS colonel drove his column hard through the narrow forest roads, leaving behind a trail of burning vehicles and scattered resistance. His Panther tanks, supported by half-tracks loaded with battle-hardened Panzer Grenadiers, moved with a speed that caught American commanders completely off guard. Lieutenant Tom Harrison of the 7th Armored Division received emergency orders to move his Sherman tank platoon south from the Netherlands to help stem the German advance. The 24-year-old officer from Texas had been looking forward to spending Christmas in a quiet sector, but now found himself racing through the Belgian countryside as part of a desperate effort to reinforce the crumbling American line. according to John Toland's definitive account in battle, The Story of the Bulge. The German planners had achieved complete tactical surprise, with American intelligence having failed to detect the massive buildup of enemy forces in the Eifel region despite clear indicators that should have warned of impending offensive operations. Staff Sergeant Henderson and the survivors of his company had been falling back through the forest for hours, fighting a series of delaying actions against Piper's advancing spearhead. The sergeant had lost contact with battalion headquarters and was operating on his own initiative, trying to keep his men together while avoiding the German armored columns that seemed to be everywhere. Private Murphy had been wounded by shrapnel during the morning bombardment, but continued to fight alongside his fellow soldiers. The key crossroads town of St. Vith became a crucial objective for both sides. As the day progressed, Brigadier General Bruce Clark of Combat Command B, 7th Armored Division, arrived in the town just as German reconnaissance elements were probing the outskirts. The experienced armor officer immediately began organizing a defense, knowing that control of St. Vith would determine whether the Germans could maintain their timetable for reaching the Meuse River. Major General Matthew Ridgway of the 18th Airborne Corps found himself hastily redeploying his reserve formations to meet the unexpected German thrust. The aggressive commander, known for his hands-on leadership style, had been planning Christmas leave for his staff when the crisis erupted. Now he was coordinating the movement of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to threaten sectors of the front. Piper's column continued its relentless advance throughout the afternoon, capturing the town of Stavelot after a brief but fierce firefight with elements of the 1st Infantry Division. The SS officer's success depended entirely on maintaining his momentum and capturing intact fuel supplies, as his tanks and vehicles were consuming gasoline at an enormous rate. During the rapid advance through difficult terrain, Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment established a defensive line along our river, trying to create some semblance of order from the chaos that had engulfed his sector. The veteran officer had fought in North Africa and Sicily, but had never faced anything like the concentrated German assault that was systematically destroying his regiment's carefully prepared positions. As darkness fell on the first day of the German offensive, Allied commanders began to grasp the true scope of Hitler's gamble. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, held an emergency conference at his headquarters in Versailles, where he made the crucial decision to commit his strategic reserves to contain the German breakthrough. The battle that would determine the fate of Nazi Germany's final offensive had only just begun. The ancient Belgian town of Bastogne sat at the center of a critical road network that would determine the success or failure of the German offensive. 7 major highways converged on the town, making it an essential prize for any force attempting to cross the Ardennes region. On December 17, 1944, both German and American commanders recognized that whoever controlled Bastogne would likely control the outcome of the entire battle. General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps received orders from Field Marshal Walter Model to capture the town at all costs. The Prussian general, a veteran of the Eastern Front, understood that his 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division must reach Bastogne before American reinforcements could establish a viable defense. His forces were already behind schedule due to unexpected resistance and traffic jams on the narrow forest roads. Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division found himself racing toward Bastogne with his paratroopers loaded into every available truck the 12th Army Group could provide. The deputy commander of the Screaming Eagles had taken charge when Major General Maxwell Taylor was recalled to Washington for consultations. McAuliffe's men had been resting and refitting near Reims after their costly victory in Operation Market Garden 3 months earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment deployed his battalion around the village of Longvilly, 6 miles east of Bastogne, as German armor approached through the morning fog. The veteran paratrooper had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through the hedgerow country, but the Ardennes presented unique challenges with its dense forests and limited fields of fire. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as Kampfgruppe Piper continued its advance toward the northwest, leaving a wake of destruction that included the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had witnessed the cold-blooded execution of 84 captured soldiers and managed to escape to warn Allied forces of the atrocity, according to Charles MacDonald's authoritative study A Time for Trumpets, the untold story of the Battle of the Bulge. The German advance created a bulge in the Allied lines that extended nearly 50 miles deep and 60 miles wide, threatening to split the British and American armies and potentially force a negotiated settlement. In the West, Major General Maurice Rose of the 3rd Armored Division received urgent orders to advance from the north, to cut off Piper's spearhead before it could reach the Meuse River bridges. The aggressive commander, known for leading from the front, pushed his Sherman tanks and armored infantry through the difficult terrain despite fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns that plagued Allied forces throughout the battle. Combat Command of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts, reached Bastogne just hours before the German encirclement became complete. The armored officer quickly established roadblocks on all 7 highways leading into the town, knowing that his small force would have to hold until McAuliffe's paratroopers could organize a proper defense. Private First Class Leo Billet of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment dug his foxhole in the frozen ground outside Bastogne. As German artillery began registering on American positions, the 19-year-old from Pennsylvania had enlisted immediately after high school graduation and found himself fighting for his life in a battle that would determine whether Nazi Germany could prolong the war into 1940-5. The encirclement of Bastogne was completed on December 20th when German forces linked up west of the town, trapping McAuliffe and approximately 15,000 American defenders. However, the delay caused by the stubborn defense had disrupted German timetables and allowed Allied commanders to rush reinforcements toward the threatened sector. The siege of Bastogne was about to begin, and with it, one of the most dramatic episodes in American military history. The fog lifted on December 21st, 1944, revealing the complete encirclement of Bastogne to both the trapped American defenders and their German besiegers. Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in his command post in the Heinz Barracks, studying maps that showed his 101st Airborne Division and attached units completely surrounded by elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The situation appeared desperate, but the veteran paratrooper remained characteristically calm as he planned the defense of the critical crossroads town. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment organized his sector of the perimeter defense, positioning his men in the villages of Champs and Rolle northwest of Bastogne. The experienced officer had fought with the 82nd Airborne Division in Sicily and recognized that the scattered nature of the Belgian countryside, with its small villages and hedge-lined fields, would favor the defenders if they could coordinate their fires effectively. General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps prepared for what he expected would be the final assault on the American garrison. The German commander had positioned his 2nd Panzer Division, Panzerlehr Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division around the town's perimeter, confident that the isolated Americans would surrender rather than face annihilation. He had no way of knowing that help was already on the way. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, received orders from General George Patton to break through to Bastogne at all costs. The aggressive tank commander, who would later become Army Chief of Staff, pushed his Sherman tanks northward from Luxembourg through snow-covered roads that German engineers had systematically blocked with fallen trees and improvised obstacles. The weather remained Bastogne's greatest enemy during the early days of the siege, as thick clouds prevented Allied aircraft from dropping desperately needed supplies or providing close air support to the beleaguered garrison. Medical supplies ran critically low, and ammunition reserves dwindled with each German attack. Captain Jack Pryor of the 326th Airborne Medical Company worked around the clock to treat wounded soldiers in makeshift aid stations established in Bastogne cellars and basements. According to Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis in Citizen Soldiers, the defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American determination and resilience, demonstrating that properly motivated infantry could hold their ground against superior numbers. When supported by effective leadership and artillery coordination, on December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American lines under a white flag, carrying an ultimatum from General von Luttwitz demanding the surrender of the garrison. The message was delivered to McAuliffe, who read it quickly and reportedly responded with a single word that would become legendary in American military history. When asked to clarify his response for the German emissaries, Colonel Harper explained that it meant go to hell. Sergeant First Class Vernon Hott of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, manned a roadblock on the Ardennes highway, watching for signs of German infiltration attempts that had become increasingly common as the siege continued. The veteran non-commissioned officer from West Virginia had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through the subsequent campaigns, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of the fighting around Bastogne. The German attacks intensified on December 23rd, as Lowitz attempted to take the town by storm. Before American relief forces could break through the encirclement, Panzer Lehr Division launched a coordinated assault against the western perimeter, supported by artillery and rocket fire that shattered buildings throughout Bastogne. However, the paratroopers held their positions, calling down devastating defensive fires from the 105th Field Artillery Group. Major William Desabry of the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion organized the defense of Noville, a village for miles northeast of Bastogne that commanded the approaches from Hofelize. The Young Officers Task Force, consisting of a company of Sherman tanks and a company of armored infantry, fought desperately against repeated German attacks throughout the day, before receiving orders to withdraw to the main defensive perimeter around Bastogne. As the fourth day of the siege ended, both sides prepared for what many believed would be the decisive phase of the battle. The weather forecast called for clearing skies, which would allow Allied aircraft to finally intervene in the ground battle, while German commanders knew they had only hours remaining to capture Bastogne before Patton's relief column could break through their lines. December 23, 1944, dawned clear and cold over the Ardennes battlefield, marking the first break in the weather that had favored German operations since the offensive began a week earlier. Colonel William Miley of the 436th Troop Carrier Group received urgent orders to prepare every available transport aircraft for an emergency supply drop to the besieged garrison. At Bastogne, the weather break had come not a moment too soon for the trapped American defenders. Major General Elwood Quesada of the 9th Tactical Air Command launched the largest close air support operation of the European campaign, sending waves of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts against German armor and supply columns throughout the Ardennes region. The aggressive air commander had been frustrated by a week of enforced inactivity due to the persistent fog and low clouds that had grounded his fighters and fighter bombers. Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe watched from his command post as the first C-47 transport aircraft appeared over Bastogne, their crews braving intense German anti-aircraft fire to deliver crucial supplies to his beleaguered paratroopers. The sight of American aircraft overhead provided an enormous morale boost to defenders who had been fighting without resupply for 4 days, subsisting on emergency rations and captured German equipment. Staff Sergeant Henry Bowman of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment emerged from his foxhole to help gather supplies that had been parachuted into the defensive perimeter. The veteran paratrooper from Oregon discovered that many of the supply bundles contained medical supplies, ammunition, and winter clothing that would be essential for continuing the defense of the town. However, some bundles had fallen within German lines, providing the enemy with American rations and equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams continued his advance toward Bastogne, with Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored Division fighting through determined German resistance. At the villages of Martlinge and Warnick, the tank commanders Shermans had covered 25 miles in 2 days, but the final 10 miles to Bastogne proved to be the most difficult, as German engineers had prepared elaborate defensive positions along every possible approach route. According to John McManus's detailed study Alamo in the Ardennes, the successful air resupply operation on December 23rd represented a turning point in the siege, providing not only essential supplies but also demonstrating to both sides that American air power could now intervene decisively in the ground battle. Camp Piper found itself increasingly isolated as Allied fighter bombers attacked its supply lines and fuel convoys throughout the Amblin River Valley. Colonel Joachim Piper, the aggressive SS officer who had spearheaded the German advance, now found his tanks immobilized by fuel shortages and his retreat route cut by American forces that had infiltrated behind his positions during the previous night. Major Hal McCown of the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, launched a carefully coordinated attack against Piper's positions near Stoumont, supported by artillery fire and air strikes that had been impossible during the previous week of bad weather. The American infantry officer had studied the German defensive positions for days, waiting for the opportunity to strike with maximum effectiveness. The German High Command recognized that the clearing weather represented a critical threat to the success of Operation Watch on the Rhine, as Allied air superiority could now be brought to bear against German supply lines and troop concentrations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, urged an immediate withdrawal to more defensible positions, but Hitler remained determined to continue the offensive, regardless of casualties. Captain James Parker of the 7th Armored Division fought desperately to hold St. Vith against renewed German attacks, knowing that the town's fall would open a direct route to the Meuse River for enemy armored formations. The Armor Officers Combat Command B had been reinforced by elements of the 106th Infantry Division, but faced overwhelming numbers as the German 5th Panzer Army concentrated its efforts against this crucial objective. As the 5th day of the siege drew to a close, both American defenders and German attackers could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire from the south, where Patton's 3rd Army continued its advance toward Bastogne. The race against time had entered its final phase, with the outcome of the entire Battle of the Bulge hanging in the balance, as relief forces fought to break through the German encirclement. General George Smith Patton Jr. stood in his 3rd Army Command post in Luxembourg City on Christmas Eve, 1944, studying situation maps that showed his forces fighting desperately to break through to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. The legendary commander had accomplished what many military experts considered impossible, pivoting 90 degrees with 3 full divisions in the middle of winter and launching a coordinated attack within 72 hours of receiving his orders from General Omar Bradley. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams pushed his Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion through the village of Assenois in the pre-dawn darkness of December 26th, knowing that Bastogne lay only 4 miles ahead through German-held territory. The aggressive armor officer had been fighting continuously for 4 days, his men surviving on minimal sleep and emergency rations while battling through one roadblock after another. Captain William Dwight of Company C, 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, followed Abrams' tanks in his half-track, ready to dismount his soldiers and clear any German positions that could threaten the armored spearhead. The infantry officer from Illinois had trained extensively in tank infantry coordination, but found the reality of combat far more chaotic than any peacetime exercise had prepared him for. Sergeant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion became the first member of Patton's relief force to make contact with the Bastogne garrison when his Sherman tank reached the southern edge of the defensive perimeter at 4:50 in the afternoon. The tank commander from New Jersey had been driving continuously for 12 hours, fighting through German positions that seemed to be everywhere in the snow-covered countryside. Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe greeted the relief column with characteristic understatement, reportedly telling Abrams that he was mighty glad to see the 3rd Army tankers. The paratrooper commander had maintained his composure throughout the siege, but privately acknowledged that his ammunition supplies had reached critically low levels and another major German attack might have overwhelmed his defenses. According to Carlo D'Este's comprehensive biography, Patton, a genius for war, the 3rd Army's advance to Bastogne represented one of the most remarkable military achievements in American history, demonstrating Patton's unparalleled ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme time pressure while maintaining the aggressive spirit that characterized all his campaigns. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Operation Watch on the Rhine, but fierce fighting continued throughout the region as German forces attempted to maintain their positions in the Ardennes salient. Major General Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps coordinated the expansion of the corridor to Bastogne, knowing that a single road connection remained vulnerable to German counterattacks. Kampfer Piper's situation had become hopeless as American forces tightened their grip around the isolated SS battle group. Colonel Joachim Piper made the difficult decision to abandon his tanks and heavy equipment, leading the surviving Panzer Grenadiers on foot through the forest toward German lines. The SS officer's bold advance had come within miles of the Meuse River, but ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Staff Sergeant Robert Bowen of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment participated in offensive operations designed to expand the Bastogne perimeter and eliminate German positions that continued to threaten the town. The veteran paratrooper had fought in every major airborne operation since Sicily and recognized that the momentum had definitely shifted in favor of American forces. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery assumed command of all Allied forces north of the German penetration, including the 1st and 9th Armies that had been separated from Bradley's 12th Army Group by the enemy advance. The British commander immediately began planning counteroffensive operations designed to eliminate the Ardennes salient and restore the original front lines. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps launched coordinated attacks against German positions throughout the northern shoulder of the Bulge, with the 82nd Airborne Division advancing toward Vilsam and the 36th Infantry Division attacking toward St. Vith. The aggressive corps commander personally reconnoitered forward positions, maintaining his reputation for hands-on leadership even in the most dangerous situations. As 1944 drew to a close, it became clear that Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed. The German offensive had gained significant ground and inflicted heavy casualties on American forces, but had ultimately exhausted the Wehrmacht's strategic reserves without achieving any of its major objectives. The stage was now set for the final Allied offensive that would carry the war into the heart of Nazi Germany. January 1st, 1945, marked the beginning of the final phase of the Battle of the Bulge as Allied forces launched coordinated counteroffensives designed to eliminate the German salient and restore the front lines that had existed before December 16th. General Dwight Eisenhower met with his senior commanders at Verdun to coordinate the complex operation that would involve British, Canadian, and American forces attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group initiated Operation Veritable from the north, with the British 30th Corps and American 7th Corps advancing toward Hofelize through difficult terrain that favored the German defenders. Major General J. Lawton Collins of the 7th Corps had earned his reputation as the Lightning Joe during the Pacific Campaign and brought that same aggressive spirit to the Ardennes battlefield. General George Patton's 3rd Army continued its attacks from the south, with the 4th Armored Division and 26th Infantry Division fighting through heavily fortified German positions that had been prepared during the preceding 2 weeks. The legendary commander remained characteristically optimistic about his force's ability to break through enemy defenses. Despite the challenging winter conditions that limited mobility and visibility, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army coordinated his forces' advance from the east, attempting to cut off German units that remained in the forward areas of the salient. The methodical commander faced the difficult task of attacking through the same forest roads that had favored the German offensive 3 weeks earlier. But now the tactical situation had been completely reversed. Staff Sergeant William Henderson of the 106th Infantry Division finally received orders to advance. After 3 weeks of defensive fighting that had decimated his regiment, the veteran non-commissioned officer from Ohio led his surviving soldiers forward through snow-covered forests where evidence of the earlier German offensive remained visible in the form of destroyed vehicles and hastily dug foxholes. According to Hugh Cole's official Army history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, the German withdrawal from the salient was conducted with typical Wehrmacht professionalism, despite the fact that many units had been reduced to less than 50% of their authorized strength. Through continuous combat and inadequate supply, Colonel Joachim Peiper and the survivors of his Kampfgruppe reached German lines after a harrowing march through Allied-controlled territory that cost him most of his remaining men. The SS officers' bold advance had captured international attention and demonstrated the continued fighting ability of German forces, but had ultimately failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives or significantly delay the Allied advance toward the Rhine River. Major General Norman Coda's 28th Infantry Division, rebuilt after its virtual destruction during the initial German assault, participated in the final operations to clear the Ardennes region of enemy forces. The Keystone Division had learned hard lessons during the early days of the battle and applied that experience to minimize casualties while maintaining pressure on retreating German units. Private First Class Leo Billet of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment advanced through the ruins of villages that had changed hands multiple times during the preceding month of fighting. The young paratrooper from Pennsylvania had survived the siege of Bastogne and now found himself pursuing the same German forces that had once surrounded his position. The final elimination of the Ardennes salient was completed on January 28, 1945, when American forces from north and south linked up at Hofelize, cutting off the last German escape routes and forcing the surrender of several thousand enemy soldiers who had been unable to withdraw across the Aar River. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended with the restoration of the original front lines. The Cost of Hitler's final offensive had been enormous for both sides, with American casualties exceeding 89,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while German losses approached 100,000 casualties plus the irreplaceable loss of most of their remaining armored reserves. The battle had delayed the Allied advance by approximately 6 weeks, but had not fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Western Europe. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, submitted his final report on Operation Watch on the Rhine to the German High Command, acknowledging that the offensive had failed to achieve its primary objectives of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated settlement. The defeat in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the final collapse of Nazi Germany's military resistance on the Western Front, as Allied forces prepared for the crossing of the Rhine River and the invasion of the German homeland itself.